backstairs at the White House, and cartoon books with clever sayings, and photo albums with balloons and the rest, and now a smash hit record. Can you tell us whether you read and listen to these things and whether they produce annoyment or enjoyment?
Annoyment. No, they produce. Yes, I have read them and listened to them. Actually, I listened to Mr. Meader's record, but I thought it sounded more like Teddy than it did me. But so he's annoyed.
In some of our major cities, John Birch or right-wing type groups have been organizing boycotts against stores which carry imports from so-called Iron Curtain countries, and in some cases intimidating the stores. The State Department suggests that this is contrary to our policy of encouraging non-strategic trade with those countries. I wonder if you share that view about those boycotts.
Yes, I don't really think that I think it harasses merchants, and I don't think it really carries on much of a effective fight against the spread of communism. If they really want to do something about the spread of communism, they will assist the Alliance for Progress, for one thing, or they will encourage their children to join the Peace Corps, or they will do a good many other things which are very greatly, they'll be generous to students who come to the United States to study and show them something of America. Those are the things that really make a difference, not going down and because some merchant happens to have Polish ham in his shop, saying he's unpatriotic doesn't seem to me to be a great contribution in the fight against communism.
The other day, Khrushchev stated that communists could learn something even from capitalists, and he even had a few kind words to say about profit incentives. Do you read any great amount of significance into this?
No, I don't. No. But, human nature is the same on both sides, fortunately, on both sides of the Iron Curtain, which is why I'm optimistic about the ultimate outcome of this struggle.
Last week, the governor of Alabama, the governor of Mississippi, and the Attorney General of Arkansas have all testified before the Senate Commerce Committee insisting that the integration move is communist-inspired, and this has led to some fears on the part of some senators that we may be entering into a period of McCarthyism that will submerge this whole issue. Can you comment on that?
We have no evidence that any of the leaders of the civil rights movements in the United States are communists. We have no evidence that the demonstrations are communist-inspired. There may be occasions when a communist takes part in a demonstration. We can't prevent that, but I think it's a convenient scapegoat to suggest that all the difficulties are communist, and if the communist movement would only disappear, that we would end this. The fact of the matter is, it's easy to blame it on the authorities in Washington. It's easy to blame it on the Attorney General or the President, say if they would just stop talking about these things, the problem would go away. The way to make the problem go away, in my opinion, is to provide for a redress of grievances.
Yes. Governor Rockefeller, Governor Romney, and Senator Goldwater, none of these gentlemen are willing to admit that they're candidates in 1964. I wonder if, to your experienced eye, any of them looks like a candidate, and if you'd care to be a little more frank than they are about your place.
If I had to, I would say that if the party, the spirit is of the party comes to them, that they will answer the call in all those three cases, and I would say that that is about my position, too.
Mr. President, the practice of managed news is attributed to your administration. Mr. Salinger says he's never had it defined. Will you give us your definition and ask us why you find it necessary to practice it?
That you are charging us with something, Miss Gray, and then you're asking me to define what it is you're charging me with. I think you might. Let me just say that we've had very limited success in managing the news, if that's what we've been trying to do. And perhaps you tell us what it is that you object to in our treatment of the news.
Are you asking me?
Yes.
Well, I don't believe in managed news at all. I thought we ought to get everything we want.
Well, I think you should too, Miss Gray. I'm for that.
President, this is a related question. It's about the Gallup poll. Has to do with a racial question. Agents of Dr. Gallup asked people this question: do you think the Kennedy administration is pushing integration too fast or not fast enough? 50% replied that they thought you were pushing too fast. Would you comment?
No, I think probably he's accurate. The fact of the matter is, this is not a matter on which you can take the temperature every week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, depending on what the newspaper headlines must be. I think you must make a judgment about the movement of the great historical event which is taking place in this country after a period of time. You judged 1863 after a good many years. Its full effect. I think we will stand on after a period of time has gone by. The fact is that same poll showed 40% or so thought it was more or less right. I thought that was rather impressive because it is change. Change always disturbs, and therefore I was surprised that there wasn't greater opposition. I think we're going at about the right tempo.
President, there have been published reports that the Russians are having second thoughts about landing a man on the moon.
I think we ought to go right ahead with our own program and go to the moon before the end of this decade. The point of the matter always has been not only of our excitement or interest in being on the moon, but the capacity to dominate space, which would be demonstrated by a moon flight, I believe is essential to the United States as the leading free world power.
President, this month we shall celebrate the second anniversary of the Alliance for Progress.
I think there's been a common recognition that there's a necessity for a revolution in Latin America, and it's either going to be peaceful or bloody. But there must be progress. There must be a revolution. In my opinion, it can be peaceful. In my opinion, given time and a concentrated effort on behalf of all of us in Latin America and in this country, we can bring about a success.
Mr. President, Dr. Teller, in urging the Senate to reject the nuclear test ban today, said that it weakens American defenses and thus invites attack.
Let's just think of the other side of it if we begin to test again, and the Soviet Union tests again, and others begin to test again. How much security do we have? As I said before in my message I sent to the Congress, we needed only one test to develop the Hiroshima weapon. Now, to anyone who works in the laboratories today, a 30 megaton weapon is perhaps not as sophisticated as a 60 or 70 or 80 megaton weapon. But it's still many, many, many times, dozens of times stronger than the weapon that flattened Hiroshima and Nagasaki. How many weapons do you need and how many megatons do you need to destroy it? I said in my speech, what we now have on hand without any further testing will kill 300 million people in 1 hour. Now that's and I suppose they can even improve on that if it's necessary.
Mr. President, just shortly after the Bay of Pigs, I asked you how you liked being president. And as I remember, you said you liked it better before the event. Now you've had a chance to appraise your job. Why do you like it, and why do you want to stay in office 4 more years?
Well, I find the work rewarding. Whether I'm going to stay and what my intentions are and all the rest seems to me still many months away. But as far as the job of president goes, it's rewarding. And I've given before to this group the definition of happiness of the Greeks. I'll define it again. The full use of your powers along lines of excellence. I find that, therefore, the president provides some happiness.
The full use of your powers along lines of excellence. I'm E.G. Marshall. Thank you for watching, and thank you, Mr. President.
That vague, soft.
Stay tuned for more on the Kennedy press conferences from presidential aide Dave Powers and New York Times columnist Tom Wicker.
John F. Kennedy loved the give and take of a press conference. He had a newspaperman's inquisitiveness. You know, I used to swim with the president every day in the White House. And the temperature of the water was 90 degrees. It was good for his back. And the day of a press conference, he'd be betting me quarters that if he pointed to Tom Wicker or Scotty Reston or Ben Bradley or Sander Van Oka, they were going to ask him such and such. And you know, he won so many quarters from me that I think I lost at least 50 cents every press conference, and we had 64.
My wife and I had been invited to the White House for a state dinner. They had the habit of inviting a few journalists every so often, and so we went to the White House dinner. And in those days, they lined up guests by in alphabetical order to go by and shake the president's hand, and then you would go down the hall to the dining room. And since my name begins with a W, we were very near the end of the line. We may have been the end of the line, I can't remember. So we went through and shook hands with the president and Mrs. Kennedy, politeness, you know, and walked on down the hall. And as we were walking down the hall towards the dining room, the president came up behind us and he took my wife by the arm. She said later she nearly fainted. And he said to her, he said, "What do you think when your husband stands up to question me on television?" And she says, I'm scared to death. And he said, "So am I," which I knew was not true, but it was a rather good example of the really charming manner the man had.
Now, the preparation he had made, he had a feeling that they asked questions in the same manner that they were writing. That if Tom Wicker was writing about Cuba and that, then, and he pointed to Tom, he'd get a question up. And if Sandy Van Oker from NBC was making a TV broadcast about a certain thing, civil rights, and he pointed to Sandy, it'd be a question on civil rights. But first he read all these papers, and then reading the paper, if there was something on the budget, then he'd have the budget man. If there was something on defense, he'd have McNamara at the meeting. Ted Sorensen, Pierre would be there, he was the press secretary. And he'd come in, Pierre had 2 briefings a day, so that if it would be a press conference at the auditorium at the State Department at 4 o'clock, Pierre would report on what kind of questions they were asking him at the 11 o'clock briefing. He'd have a briefing in the morning for the afternoon press, and a briefing in the afternoon for the next day group. And I do not believe we ever had a president so well aware of the type of questions that he might receive.
We had an interesting procedure in those days, the New York Times did. James Reston was our bureau chief, and when a news conference was scheduled, and we usually knew a couple of days in advance at least, and they were quite regular, about every other week, we would meet, members of the bureau would meet in Reston's office beforehand, and we would plan, 5 or 6 questions that we wanted to ask. And I, as the White House correspondent with the assigned seat down front, would be expected to get in one of those questions, and I was called on at almost every news conference.
He wondered when he used to watch other press conferences why they were not live. And he had made up his mind, you know, after the great success that the debates with Nixon, he felt he couldn't have been elected without the debates, the 4 debates, that it was impossible for a senator from Massachusetts to get enough exposure between the nomination date and the election date to receive the 34,227,000 votes. And with this confidence in mind, he had decided, we were down in Palm Beach when he talked about it in between this time. He's talking about, I went from senator to president in 11 weeks. And in that short time, I inherited Cuba and Laos and Berlin, the nuclear threat and everything else. And he said, these topics can best be explained to the people live.
I think he began to develop usages and customs that have become vital to the presidency today. The first television president. And that is not to denigrate him in that sense or any of the presidents who followed. I think we have today, because of the ubiquitous nature of television in our society, we have a television politics rather than